His Unconquerable Enemy. W. C. Morrow. William Chambers Morrow, 1854–1923, was an American writer, best known for his horror and suspense stories. He wrote romance novels and travel pieces as well, and eventually opened a school for writers. In 1889, Ambrose Pierce had just finished a term of employment at the Argonaut magazine and recommended Morrow's work to the magazine. As a result, the following story appeared in the March 11, 1889 issue of the Argonaut, a chilling tale of relentless vengeance. It has been much anthologized.
I was summoned from Calcutta to the heart of India to perform a difficult surgical operation on one of the women of a great Rajah's household. I found the Rajah a man of noble character, but possessed, as I afterward discovered, of a sense of cruelty purely oriental and in contrast to the indolence of his disposition. He was so grateful for the success that attended my mission that he urged me to remain a guest at the palace as long as it might please me to stay, and I thankfully accepted the invitation. One of the male servants attracted my notice for his marvelous capacity of malice. His name was Naranya, and I am certain that there must have been a large proportion of Malay blood in his veins, for, unlike the Indians, from whom he differed also in complexion, he was extremely alert, active, nervous, and sensitive. A redeeming circumstance was his love for his master. Once his violent temper led him to the commission of an atrocious crime, the fatal stabbing of a dwarf. In punishment for this, the Rajah ordered that Naranya's right arm, the offending one, be severed from his body. The sentence was executed in a bungling fashion by a stupid fellow armed with an axe, and I, being a surgeon, was compelled, in order to save Naranya's life, to perform an amputation of the stump, leaving not a vestige of the limb remaining. After this he developed an augmented fiendishness. His love for the Rajah was changed to hate, and in his mad anger he flung discretion to the winds. Driven once to frenzy by the Rajah's scornful treatment, he sprang upon the Rajah with a knife, but fortunately was seized and disarmed. To his unspeakable dismay, the Rajah sentenced him for this offense to suffer amputation of the remaining arm. It was done as in the former instance. This had the effect of putting a temporary curb on Naranya's spirit, or rather, of changing the outward manifestations of his diabolism. Being armless, he was at first largely at the mercy of those who ministered to his needs, a duty which I undertook to see was properly discharged, for I felt an interest in this strangely distorted nature. His sense of helplessness, combined with a damnable scheme for revenge which he had secretly formed, caused Naranya to change his fierce, impetuous, and unruly conduct into a smooth, quiet, insinuating bearing, which he carried so artfully as to deceive those with whom he was brought in contact, including the Rajah himself. Naranya, being exceedingly quick, intelligent, and dexterous, and having an unconquerable will, turned his attention to the cultivating of an enlarged usefulness of his legs, feet, and toes, with so excellent effect that in time he was able to perform wonderful feats with those members. Thus his capability, especially for destructive mischief, was considerably restored. One morning the Rajah's only son, a young man of an uncommonly amiable and noble disposition, was found dead in bed. His murder was a most atrocious one, his body being mutilated in a shocking manner. But in my eyes, the most significant of all the mutilations was the entire removal and disappearance of the young prince's arms. The death of the young man nearly brought the Rajah to the grave. It was not, therefore, until I had nursed him back to health that I began a systematic inquiry into the murder. I said nothing of my own discoveries and conclusions until after the Rajah and his officers had failed, and my work had been done. Then I submitted to him a written report, making a close analysis of all the circumstances, and closing by charging the crime to Naranya. The Rajah, convinced by my proof and argument, at once ordered Naranya to be put to death, this to be accomplished slowly and with frightful tortures. The sentence was so cruel and revolting that it filled me with horror, and I implored that the wretch be shot. Finally, through a sense of gratitude to me, the Rajah relaxed. When Naranya was charged with the crime, he denied it, of course. But, seeing that the Rajah was convinced, He threw aside all restraint, and, dancing, laughing, and shrieking in the most horrible manner, confessed his guilt, gloated over it, and reviled the Rajah to his teeth. This, knowing that some fearful death awaited him. The Rajah decided upon the details of the matter that night, and in the morning he informed me of his decision. It was that Naranya's life should be spared, but that both of his legs should be broken with hammers, and that then I should amputate the limbs at the trunk. Appended to this horrible sentence was a provision that the maimed wretch should be kept and tortured at regular intervals by such means as afterward might be devised. Sickened to the heart by the awful duty set out for me, I nevertheless performed it with success, and I care to say nothing more about that part of the tragedy. Naranya escaped death very narrowly, and was a long time in recovering his wonted vitality. During all these weeks the Rajah neither saw him nor made inquiries concerning him. But when, as in duty bound, I made official report that the man had recovered his strength, the Rajah's eyes brightened, and he emerged with deadly activity from the stupor into which he so long had been plunged. The Rajah's palace was a noble structure, but it is necessary here to describe only the grand hall. It was an immense chamber, with a floor of polished inlaid stone and a lofty arched ceiling. A soft light stole into it through a stained glass set in the roof, and in high windows on one side. In the middle of the room was a rich fountain, which threw up a tall, slender column of water, with smaller and shorter jets grouped around it. Across one end of the hall, halfway to the ceiling, was a balcony, which communicated with the upper story of a wing, and from which a flight of stone stairs descended to the floor of the hall. During the hot summers this room was delightfully cool. It was the Rajah's favorite lounging place, and when the nights were hot, he had his cot taken thither, and there he slept. This hall was chosen for Naranya's permanent prison. Here was he to stay so long as he might live, with never a glimpse of the shining world or the glorious heavens. To one of his nervous, discontented nature, such confinement was worse than death. At the Rajah's order, there was constructed for him a small pen of open ironwork, circular, and about 4 feet in diameter, elevated on 4 slender iron posts, 10 feet above the floor, and placed between the balcony and the fountain. Such was Naranya's prison. The pen was about 4 feet in depth, and the pen top was left open for the convenience of the servants, whose duty it should be to care for him. These precautions for a safe confinement were taken at my suggestion, for, although the man was now deprived of all 4 of his limbs, I still feared that he might develop some extraordinary, unheard-of power for mischief. It was provided that the attendant should reach his cage by means of a movable ladder. All these arrangements having been made, and Naranya hoisted into his cage, the Rajah emerged upon the balcony to see him for the first time since the last amputation. Naranya had been lying panting and helpless on the floor of his cage, but when his quick ear caught the sound of the Rajah's footfall, he squirmed about until he had brought the back of his head against the railing, elevating his eyes above his chest and enabling him to peer through the openwork of the cage. Thus the 2 deadly enemies faced each other. The Rajah's stern face paled at sight of the hideous, shapeless thing which met his gaze, but he soon recovered, and the old, hard, cruel, sinister look returned. Naranya's black hair and beard had grown long, and they added to the natural ferocity of his aspect. His eyes blazed upon the Rajah with a terrible light, his lips parted, and he gasped for breath. His face was ashen with rage and despair, and his thin, distended nostrils quivered. The Rajah folded his arms and gazed down from the balcony upon the frightful wreck that he had made. Oh, the dreadful pathos of that picture, the inhumanity of it, the deep and dismal tragedy of it. Who might look into the wild, despairing heart of the prisoner and see and understand the frightful turmoil there, the surging, choking passion, unbridled but impotent ferocity, frantic thirst for a vengeance that should be deeper than hell? Naranya gazed, his shapeless body heaving, his eyes aflame. And then, in a strong, clear voice, which rang throughout the great hall, with rapid speech he hurled at the Rajah the most insulting defiance, the most awful curses. He cursed the womb that had conceived him, the food that should nourish him, the wealth that had brought him power, cursed him in the name of Buddha and all the wise men, cursed by the sun, the moon, and the stars, by the continents, mountains, oceans, and rivers, by all things living, cursed his head, his heart, his entrails, cursed in a whirlwind of unmentionable words, heaped unimaginable insults and contumely upon him, called him a knave, a beast, a fool, a liar, an infamous and unspeakable coward. The Rajah heard it all calmly, without the movement of a muscle, without the slightest change of countenance, and when the poor wretch had exhausted his strength and fallen helpless and silent to the floor, the Rajah, with a grim, cold smile, turned and strode away. The days passed. The Rajah, not deterred by Naranya's curses often heaped upon him, spent even more time than formerly in the great hall, and slept there oftener at night. And finally Naranya wearied of cursing and defying him, and fell into a sullen silence. The man was a study for me, and I observed every change in his fleeting moods. Generally his condition was that of miserable despair, which he attempted bravely to conceal. Even the boon of suicide had been denied him, for when he would wriggle into an erect position, the rail of his pen was a foot above his head, so that he could not clamber over and break his skull on the stone floor beneath. And when he tried to starve himself, the attendants forced food down his throat, so that he abandoned such attempts. At times his eyes would blaze and his breath would come in gasps, for imaginary vengeance was working within him. But steadily he became quieter and more tractable, and was pleasant and responsive when I would converse with him. Whatever might have been the tortures which the Rajah had decided on, none as yet had been ordered, and although Naranya knew that they were in contemplation, he never referred to them or complained of his lot. The awful climax of this situation was reached one night, and even after this lapse of years, I cannot approach its description without a shudder. It was a hot night, and the Rajah had gone to sleep in the great hall, lying on a high cot placed on the main floor just underneath the edge of the balcony. I had been unable to sleep in my own apartment, and so I had stolen into the great hall through the heavily curtained entrance at the end farthest from the balcony. As I entered, I heard a peculiar, soft sound above the patter of the fountain. Naranya's cage was partly concealed from my view by the spraying water, but I suspected that the unusual sound came from him. Stealing a little to one side, and crouching against the dark hangings of the wall, I could see him in the faint light which dimly illuminated the hall. And then I discovered that my surmise was correct. Naranya was quietly at work. Curious to learn more, and knowing that only mischief could have been inspiring him, I sank into a thick robe on the floor and watched him. To my great astonishment, Naranya was tearing off with his teeth the bag which served as his outer garment. He did it cautiously, casting sharp glances frequently at the Rajah, who, sleeping soundly on his cot below, breathed heavily. After starting a strip with his teeth, Naranya, by the same means, would attach it to the railing of his cage and then wriggle away, much after the manner of a caterpillar's crawling, and this would cause the strip to be torn out the full length of his garment. He repeated this operation with incredible patience and skill until his entire garment had been torn into strips. 2 or 3 of these he tied end to end with his teeth, lips, and tongue, tightening the knots by placing one end of the strip under his body and drawing the other taut with his teeth. In this way he made a line several feet long, one end of which he made fast to the rail with his mouth. It then began to dawn upon me that he was going to make an insane attempt, impossible of achievement without hands, feet, arms, or legs, to escape from his cage. For what purpose? The Rajah was asleep in the hall. I caught my breath. Oh, the desperate, insane thirst for revenge, which could have unhinged so clear and firm a mind. Even though he should accomplish the impossible feat of climbing over the railing of his cage, that he might fall to the floor below, for how could he slide down the rope? He would be in all probability killed or stunned. And even if he should escape these dangers, it would be impossible for him to clamber upon the cot without rousing the Rajah, and impossible even though the Rajah were dead. Amazed at the man's daring, and convinced that his sufferings and brooding had destroyed his reason, nevertheless I watched him with breathless interest. With other strips tied together, he made a short swing across one side of his cage. He caught the long line in his teeth at a point not far from the rail. Then, wriggling with great effort to an upright position, His back braced against the rail. He put his chin over the swing and worked toward one end. He tightened the grasp of his chin on the swing, and with tremendous exertion, working the lower end of his spine against the railing, he began gradually to ascend the side of his cage. The labor was so great that he was compelled to pause at intervals, and his breathing was hard and painful, and even while thus resting, he was in a position of terrible strain, and his pushing against the swing caused it to press hard against his windpipe and nearly strangle him. After amazing effort, he had elevated the lower end of his body until it protruded above the railing, the top of which was now across the lower end of his abdomen. Gradually he worked his body over, going backward, until there was sufficient excess of weight on the outer side of the rail. And then, with a quick lurch, he raised his head and shoulders and swung into a horizontal position on top of the rail. Of course, he would have fallen to the floor below had it not been for the line which he held in his teeth. With so great nicety had he estimated the distance between his mouth and the point where the rope was fastened to the rail, that the line tightened and checked him just as he reached the horizontal position on the rail. If one had told me beforehand that such a feat as I had just seen this man accomplish was possible, I should have thought him a fool. Naranja was now balanced on his stomach across the top of the rail, and he eased his position by bending his spine and hanging down on either side as much as possible. Having rested thus for some minutes, he began cautiously to slide off backward, slowly paying out the line through his teeth, finding almost a fatal difficulty in passing the knots. Now, it is quite possible that the line would have escaped altogether from his teeth laterally when he would slightly relax his hold to let it slip, had it not been for a very ingenious plan to which he had resorted. This consisted in his having made a turn of the line around his neck before he attacked the swing, thus securing a threefold control of the line, one by his teeth, another by friction against his neck, and a third by his ability to compress it between his cheek and shoulder. It was quite evident now that the minutest details of a most elaborate plan had been carefully worked out by him before beginning the task, and that possibly weeks of difficult theoretical study had been consumed in the mental preparation. As I observed him, I was reminded of certain hitherto unaccountable things which he had been doing for some weeks past, going through certain hitherto inexplicable motions, undoubtedly for the purpose of training his muscles for the immeasurably arduous labor which he was now performing. A stupendous and seemingly impossible part of his task had been accomplished. Could he reach the floor in safety? Gradually he worked himself backward over the rail, in imminent danger of falling, but his nerve never wavered, and I could see a wonderful light in his eyes. With something of a lurch, his body fell against the outer side of the railing, to which he was hanging by his chin, the line still held firmly in his teeth. Slowly he slipped his chin from the rail, and then hung suspended by the line in his teeth. By almost imperceptible degrees, with infinite caution, he descended the line, and finally his unwieldy body rolled upon the floor, safe and unhurt. What miracle would this superhuman monster next accomplish? I was quick and strong, and was ready and able to intercept any dangerous act, but not until danger appeared would I interfere with this extraordinary scene. I must confess to astonishment upon having observed that Naranja, instead of proceeding directly toward the sleeping Raja, took quite another direction. Then it was only escape, after all, that the wretch contemplated, and not the murder of the Raja. But how could he escape? The only possible way to reach the outer air without great risk was by ascending the stairs to the balcony and leaving by the corridor which opened upon it, and thus fall into the hands of some British soldiers quartered thereabout, who might conceive the idea of hiding him. But surely it was impossible for Naranja to ascend that long flight of stairs. Nevertheless, he made directly for them, his method of progression this. He lay upon his back, with the lower end of his body toward the stairs, then bowed his spine upward, thus drawing his head and shoulders a little forward, straightened, and then pushed the lower end of his body forward a space equal to that through which he had drawn his head, repeating this again and again, each time while bending his spine, preventing his head from slipping by pressing it against the floor. His progress was laborious and slow, but sensible, and finally he arrived at the foot of the stairs. It was manifest that his insane purpose was to ascend them. The desire for freedom must have been strong within him. Wriggling to an upright position against the newel post, he looked up at the great height which he had to climb, and sighed. But there was no dimming of the light in his eyes. How could he accomplish the impossible task? His solution of the problem was very simple, though daring and perilous as all the rest. While leaning against the newel post, he let himself fall diagonally upon the bottom step, where he lay partly hanging over, but safe on his side. Turning upon his back, he wriggled forward along the step to the rail, and raised himself to an upright position against it, as he had against the newel post, fell as before, and landed on the second step. In this manner, with inconceivable labor, he accomplished the ascent of the entire flight of stairs. It being apparent to me that the Rajah was not the object of Naranya's movements, the anxiety which I had felt on that account was now entirely dissipated. The things which already he had accomplished were entirely beyond the nimblest imagination. The sympathy which I had always felt for the wretched man was now greatly quickened, and as infinitesimally small as I knew his chances for escape to be, I nevertheless hoped that he would succeed. Any assistance from me, however, was out of the question, and it never should be known that I had witnessed the escape. Naranya was now upon the balcony, and I could dimly see him wriggling along toward the door which led out upon the balcony. Finally he stopped and wriggled to an upright position against the rail, which had wide openings between the balusters. His back was toward me, but he slowly turned and faced me and the hall. At that great distance I could not distinguish his features, but the slowness with which he had worked, even before he had fully accomplished the ascent of the stairs, was evidence all too eloquent of his extreme exhaustion. Nothing but a most desperate resolution could have sustained him thus far, but he had drawn upon the last remnant of his strength. He looked around the hall with a sweeping glance, and then down upon the Rajah, who was sleeping immediately beneath him, over 20 feet below. He looked long and earnestly, sinking lower and lower and lower upon the rail. Suddenly, to my inconceivable astonishment and dismay, he toppled through and shot downward from his lofty height. I held my breath, expecting to see him crushed upon the stone floor beneath, but instead of that, he fell full upon the Rajah's breast, driving him through the cot to the floor. I sprang forward with a loud cry for help, and was instantly at the scene of the catastrophe. With indescribable horror, I saw that Naranya's teeth were buried in the Rajah's throat. I tore the wretch away, but the blood was pouring from the Rajah's arteries. His chest was crushed in, and he was gasping in the agony of death. People came running in, terrified. I turned to Naranya. He lay upon his back, his face hideously smeared with blood. Murder, and not escape, had been his intention from the beginning, and he had employed the only method by which there was ever a possibility of accomplishing it. I knelt beside him, and saw that he too was dying. His back had been broken by the fall. He smiled sweetly into my face, and a triumphant look of accomplished revenge sat upon his face, even in death.
In Dark New England Days, Sarah Orne Jewett. Sarah Orne Jewett, 1849 to 1909, was an American writer of short stories and novels, mostly set in or around her home in South Berwick, Maine, a New England seaport during the decline of the maritime trade. Jewett never married, but for many years shared a household with writer Annie Fields after Fields's husband died. The following story first appeared in Jewett's collection, Strangers and Wayfarers, published in 1890.
The last of the neighbors was going home. Officious Mrs. Peter Downs had lingered late, and sought for additional housework with which to prolong her stay. She had talked incessantly, and buzzed like a busy bee as she helped to put away the best crockery after the funeral supper, while the sisters Betsy and Hannah Knowles grew every moment more forbidding and unwilling to speak. They lighted a solitary small oil lamp at last, as if for Sunday evening idleness, and put it on the side table in the kitchen. "We ain't intending to make a late evening of it," announced Betsy, the elder, standing before Mrs. Downs in an expectant, final way, making an irresistible opportunity for saying good night. "I'm sure we're more than obliged to you, ain't we, Hannah? But I don't feel as if we ought to keep you longer. We ain't going to do no more tonight but set down a spell and kind of collect ourselves, and then make for bed." Martha Downs offered one more plea. "I'd stop all night with you, and welcome. 'Tis getting late, and dark," she added plaintively, but the sisters shook their heads quickly, while Hannah said that they might as well get used to staying alone, since they would have to do it first or last. In spite of herself, Mrs. Downs was obliged to put on her funeral best bonnet and shawl, and start on her homeward way. "Close-mouthed old maids," she grumbled, as the door shut behind her all too soon and denied her the light of the lamp along the footpath. Suddenly there was a bright ray from the window, as if someone had pushed back the curtain and stood with the lamp close to the sash. "That's Hannah," said the retreating guest. "She'd 'a' told me something about things, I know, if it hadn't 'a' been for Betsy. Catch me working myself to pieces again for 'em." But however grudgingly this was said, Mrs. Downs's conscience told her that the industry of the past 2 days had been somewhat selfish on her part. She had hoped that in the excitement of this unexpected funeral season, she might for once be taken into the sisters' confidence. More than this, she knew that they were certain of her motive, and had deliberately refused the expected satisfaction. "'Tain't as if I was one of them curious busybodies, anyway," she said to herself pityingly. "They might have neighbored with somebody for once, I do believe." Everybody would have a question ready for her the next day, for it was known that she had been slaving herself devotedly since the news had come of old Captain Knowles's sudden death in his bed from a stroke, the last of 3, which had in the course of a year or 2 changed him from a strong old man to a feeble, chair-bound cripple. Mrs. Downs stepped bravely along the dark country road. She could see a light in her own kitchen window half a mile away, and did not stop to notice either the penetrating dampness or the shadowy woods at her right. It was a cloudy night, but there was a dim light over the open fields. She had a disposition of mind towards the exciting circumstances of death and burial, and was in request at such times among her neighbors. In this she was like a city person who prefers tragedy to comedy, but not having the semblance within her reach, she made the most of looking on at real griefs and departures. Someone was walking towards her in the road. Suddenly she heard footsteps. The figure stopped, then came forward again.
"Oh, 'tis you, ain't it?"
with a tone of disappointment.
"I cal'lated you'd stop all night. It got to be so late, and I was just going over to the Knowles gals. Well, to kind-o' ask how they be, and—"
Mr. Peter Downs was evidently counting on his visit. "They never passed me the compliment," replied the wife. "I declare I didn't covet the walk home. I'm most beat out being on foot so much. I was most put out with 'em for letting of me see quite so plain that my room was better than my company. But I don't know's I blame 'em. They want to look and see what they've got, and kind of get by theirselves, I expect. 'Twas natural." Mrs. Downs knew that her husband would resent her first statements, being a sensitive and grumbling man. She had formed a pacific habit of suiting her remarks to his point of view to save an outburst. He contented himself with calling the Knowles girls hoggish, and put a direct question as to whether they had let fall any words about their situation, but Martha Downs was obliged to answer in the negative.
"Was Enoch Holt there after the folks come back from the grave?"
"He wa'n't.
They never give him no encouragement, neither. He appeared well, I must say, continued Peter Downs. He took his place next, but one behind us in the procession, long of Melinda Dutch, and walked to and from with her, give her his arm, and then I never see him after we got back. But I thought he might be somewhere in the house, and I was out about the barn, and so on. They was civil to him. I was by when he come, just stepping out of the bedroom after we'd finished laying the old captain into his coffin. Hannah looked real pleased when she see Enoch, as if she hadn't really expected him, but Betsy stuck out her hands if 'twasn't aimed aboard, and drawed her face solemner than ever. There they had natural feelings. He was their own father, when all was said, the captain was, and I don't know but he was clever to 'em in his way, 'ceptin' when he disappointed Hannah about her marryin' Jake Gooden. She learned to respect the old captain's foresight, too. Sakes alive, Matty, how you do knock folks down with one hand and set 'em up with t'other,
chuckled Mr. Downs. They next discussed the captain's appearance as he lay in state in the front room, a subject which, with its endless ramifications, would keep the whole neighborhood interested for weeks to come. An hour later, the twinkling light in the Downs house suddenly disappeared. As Martha Downs took a last look out of doors through her bedroom window, she could see no other light. The neighbors had all gone to bed. It was a little past 9, and the night was damp and still. The Captain Knowles place was eastward from the Downs, and a short turn in the road and the piece of hardwood growth hid one house from the other. At this unwontedly late hour, the elderly sisters were still sitting in their warm kitchen. There were bright coals under the singing tea-kettle, which hung from the crane by 3 or 4 long pot-hooks. Betsy Knowles objected when her sister offered to put on more wood. Father never liked to leave no grate of a fire, even though he slept right here in the bedroom. He said this floor was one that would light and catch easy, you remember. Another winter we can move down and take the bedroom ourselves. 'Twill be warmer for us, suggested Hannah, but Betsy shook her head doubtfully. The thought of their old father's grave, unwatched and undefended in the outermost dark field, filled their hearts with a strange tenderness. They had been his dutiful, patient slaves, and it seemed like disloyalty to have abandoned the poor shape. To be sitting there, disregarding the 1,000 requirements and services of the past. More than all, they were facing a free future. They were their own mistresses at last, though past 60 years of age. Hannah was still a child at heart. She chased away a dread suspicion, when Betsy forbade the wood, lest this elder sister, who favored their father's looks, might take his place as stern ruler of the household. "Betsy," said the younger sister suddenly, "we'll have us a cook stove, won't we, next winter? I expect we're going to have something to do with." Betsy did not answer. It was impossible to say whether she truly felt grief or only assumed it. She had been sober and silent for the most part since she routed neighbor Downs, though she answered her sister's prattling questions with patience and sympathy. Now she rose from her chair and went to one of the windows, and pushing back the sash curtain, pulled the wooden shutter across and hasped it. "I ain't going to bed just yet," she explained. "I've been a-waiting to make sure nobody was coming in. I don't know's there'll be any better time to look in the chest and see what we've got to depend on. We never'll get no chance to do it by day." Hannah looked frightened for a moment, then nodded and turned to the opposite window and pulled that shutter with much difficulty. It had always caught and hitched and been provoking, a warped piece of red oak, when even-grained white pine would have saved strength and patience to 3 generations of the Knowles race. Then the sisters crossed the kitchen and opened the bedroom door. Hannah shivered a little as the colder air struck her, and her heart beat loudly. Perhaps it was the same with Betsy. The bedroom was clean and orderly for the funeral guests. Instead of the blue homespun, there was a beautifully quilted white coverlet, which had been part of their mother's wedding furnishing, and this made the bedstead, with its 4 low posts, look unfamiliar and awesome. The lamplight shone through the kitchen door behind them, not very bright at best, but Betsy reached under the bed, and with all the strength she could muster, pulled out the end of a great sea-chest. The sisters tugged together and pushed, and made the most of their strength before they finally brought it through the narrow door into the kitchen. The solemnity of the deed made them both whisper as they talked, and Hannah did not dare to say what was in her timid heart, that she would rather brave discovery by daylight than such a feeling of being disapprovingly watched now in the dead of night. There came a slight sound outside the house, which made her look anxiously at Betsy, but Betsy remained tranquil. "It's nothing but a stick fallen down the wood-pile," she answered in a contemptuous whisper, and the younger woman was reassured. Betsy reached deep into her pocket and found a great key, which was worn smooth and bright like silver, and never had been trusted willingly, even into her own careful hands. Hannah held the lamp, and the 2 thin figures bent eagerly over the lid as it opened. Their shadows were waving about the low walls, and looked like strange shapes bowing and dancing behind them. The chest was stoutly timbered, as if it were built in some shipyard, and there were heavy wrought-iron hinges and a large escutcheon for the keyhole that the ship's blacksmith might have hammered out. On the top, somebody had scratched deeply the crossed lines for a game of fox and geese, which had a trivial, irreverent look, and might have been the unforgiven fault of some idle ship's boy. The sisters had hardly dared look at the chest, or to signify their knowledge of its existence at unwary times. They had swept carefully about it year after year, and wondered if it were indeed full of gold, as the neighbors used to hint. But no matter how much found a way in, little had found the way out. They had been hampered all their lives for money, and in consequence had developed a wonderful facility for spinning and weaving, mending and making. Their small farm was an early example of intensive farming. They were allowed to use its products in a niggardly way, but the money that was paid for wool, for hay, for wood, and for summer crops had all gone into the chest. The old captain was a hard master. He rarely commended and often blamed. Hannah trembled before him, but Betsy faced him sturdily, being amazingly like him, with a feminine difference. As like as a ruled person can be to a ruler, for the discipline of life had taught the man to aggress, the woman only to defend. In the chest was a fabled sum of prize money. Besides these slender earnings of many years, all the sisters' hard work and self-sacrifice were there in money, and a mysterious largesse besides. All their lives they had been looking forward to this hour of ownership. There was a solemn hush in the house. The 2 sisters were safe from their neighbors, and there was no fear of interruption at such an hour in that hard-working community, tired with a day's work that had been early begun. If anyone came knocking at the door, both door and windows were securely fastened. The eager sisters bent above the chest. They held their breath and talked in softest whispers. With stealthy tread, a man came out of the woods nearby. He stopped to listen, came nearer, stopped again, and then crept close to the old house. He stepped upon the banking, next the window with the warped shutter. There was a knothole in it, high above the women's heads towards the top. As they leaned over the chest, an eager eye watched them. If they had turned that way suspiciously, the eye might have caught the flicker of the lamp and betrayed itself. No, they were too busy. The eye at the shutter watched and watched. There was a certain feeling of relief in the sisters' minds, because the contents of the chest were so commonplace at first sight. There were some old belongings dating back to their father's early days of seafaring. They unfolded a waistcoat pattern or 2 of figured stuff, which they had seen him fold and put away again and again. Once he had given Betsy a gay china silk handkerchief, and here were 2 more like it. They had not known what a store of treasures might be waiting for them, but the reality so far was disappointing. There was much spare room to begin with, and the wares within looked pinched and few. There were bundles of papers, old receipts, some letters in 2 not very thick bundles, some old account books with worn edges, and a blackened silver can which looked very small in comparison with their anticipation, being an heirloom and jealously hoarded and secreted by the old man. The women began to feel as if his lean, angry figure were bending with them over the sea-chest. They opened a package wrapped in many layers of old soft paper, a worked piece of Indian muslin, and an embroidered red scarf which they had never seen before.
"He must have brought them home to Mother,"
said Betsy, with a great outburst of feeling.
"He never was the same man again. He never would let nobody else have them when he found she was dead, poor old father."
Hannah looked wistfully at the treasures. She rebuked herself for selfishness, but she thought of her pinched girlhood and the delight these things would have been. Ah, yes, it was too late now for many things besides the sprigged muslin.
"If I was young as I was once, there's lots of things I'd like to do now I'm free,"
said Hannah with a gentle sigh. But her sister checked her anxiously. It was fitting that they should preserve a semblance of mourning, even to themselves. The lamp stood in a kitchen chair at the chest's end, and shone full across their faces. Betsy looked intent and sober as she turned over the old man's treasures. Under the India mull was an antique pair of buff trousers, a waistcoat of strange, old-fashioned foreign stuff, and a blue coat with brass buttons, brought home from overseas, as the women knew, for their father's wedding clothes. They had seen him carry them out at long intervals to hang them in the spring sunshine. He had been very feeble the last time, and Hannah remembered that she had longed to take them from his shaking hands.
"I declare I thought I wished we'd laid him out in them, 'stead of the robe,"
she whispered, but Betsy made no answer. She was kneeling still, but held herself upright and looked away. It was evident that she was lost in her own thoughts.
"I can't find nothing else by eyesight," she muttered. "This chest never'd be so heavy with them old clothes. Stop, hold that light down, Hannah. There's a place underneath here. Them papers in the till takes a shallow part. Oh, my gracious! See here, will you? Hold the light! Hold the light!"
There was a hidden drawer in the chest's side, a long, deep place, and it was full of gold pieces. Hannah had seated herself in the chair to be out of her sister's way. She held the lamp with one hand and gathered her apron on her lap with the other, while Betsy, exultant and hawk-eyed, took out handful after handful of heavy coins, letting them jingle and chink, letting them shine in the lamp's rays, letting them roll across the floor. Guineas, dollars, doubloons, old French and Spanish and English gold. Now, look, the eye at the window. At last they had found it all. The bag of silver, the great roll of bank bills, and the heavy weight of gold. The prize money that had been like Robinson Crusoe's in the cave. They were rich women that night. Their faces grew young again as they sat side by side and exulted while the old kitchen grew cold. There was nothing they might not do within the range of their timid ambitions. They were women of fortune now, and their own mistresses. They were beginning, at last, to live. The watcher outside was cramped and chilled. He let himself down softly from the high step of the winter banking and crept toward the barn where he might bury himself in the hay and think. His fingers were quick to find the peg that opened the little barn door. The beasts within were startled and stumbled to their feet, then went back to their slumbers. The night wore on. The light spring rain began to fall, and the sound of it on the house roof close down upon the sisters' bed lulled them quickly to sleep. 12, 1, 2 o'clock passed by. They had put back the money and the clothes and the minor goods and treasures, and pulled the chest back into the bedroom, so that it was out of sight from the kitchen. The bedroom door was always shut by day. The younger sister wished to carry the money to their own room, but Betsy disdained such precaution. The money had always been safe in the old chest, and there it should stay. The next week they would go to Riverport and put it into the bank. It was no use to lose the interest any longer. Because their father had lost some invested money in his early youth, it did not follow that every bank was faithless. Betsy's self-assertion was amazing, but they still whispered to each other as they got ready for bed. With strange forgetfulness, Betsy had laid the chest key on the white coverlet in the bedroom, and left it there. In August of that year, the whole countryside turned out to go to court. The sisters had been rich for one night. In the morning they waked to find themselves poor, with a bitter pang of poverty of which they had never dreamed. They had said little, but they grew suddenly pinched and old. They could not tell how much money they had lost, except that Hannah's lap was full of gold, a weight she could not lift nor carry. After a few days of stolid misery, they had gone to the chief lawyer of their neighborhood to accuse Enoch Holt of robbery. They dressed in their best and walked solemnly side by side across the fields and along the road, the shortest way to the man of law. Enoch Holt's daughter saw them go as she stood in her doorway, and felt a cold shiver run through her frame as if in foreboding. Her father was not at home. He had left for Boston late on the afternoon of Captain Knowles's funeral. He had had notice the day before of the coming in of a ship in which he owned a 32nd. There was talk of selling the ship, and the owner's agent had summoned him. He had taken pains to go to the funeral because he and the old captain had been on bad terms ever since they had bought a piece of woodland together, and the captain declared himself wronged at the settling of accounts. He was growing feeble even then, and had left the business to the younger man. Enoch Holt was not a trusted man, yet he had never before been openly accused of dishonesty. He was not a professor of religion, but foremost on the secular side of church matters. Most of the men in that region were hard men. It was difficult to get money, and there was little real comfort in a community where the sterner, stingier, forbidding side of New England life was well exemplified. The proper steps had been taken by the officers of the law, and in answer to the writ, Enoch Holt appeared, much shocked and very indignant, and was released on bail, which covered the sum his shipping interest had brought him. The weeks had dragged by. June and July were long in passing, and here was court day at last, and all the townsfolk hastening by high roads and by-roads to the courthouse. The Knowles girls themselves had risen at break of day, and walked the distance steadfastly, like two of the three fates. Who would make the third to cut the thread for their enemy's disaster? Public opinion was divided. There were many voices ready to speak on the accused man's side. A sharp-looking acquaintance left his business in Boston to swear that Holt was in his office before noon on the day following the robbery, and that he had spent most of the night in Boston, as proved by several minor details of their interview. As for Holt's young married daughter, she was a favorite with the townsfolk, and her husband was away at sea overdue these last few weeks. She sat on one of the hard court benches with a young child in her arms, born since its father sailed. They had been more or less unlucky, the Holt family, though Enoch himself was a man of brag and bluster. All the hot August morning until the noon recess, and all the hot August afternoon, fly-teased and wretched with the heavy air, the crowd of neighbors listened to the trial. There was not much evidence brought. Everybody knew that Enoch Holt left the funeral procession hurriedly and went away on horseback towards Boston. His daughter knew no more than this. The Boston man gave his testimony impatiently, and one or two persons insisted that they saw the accused on his way at nightfall, several miles from home. As the testimony came out, it all tended to prove his innocence, though public opinion was to the contrary. The Knowles sisters looked more stern and gray hour by hour. Their vengeance was not to be satisfied. Their accusation had been listened to and found wanting, but their instinctive knowledge of the matter counted for nothing. They must have been watched through the knothole of the shutter. Nobody had noticed it, until some years before Enoch Holt himself had spoken of the lights shining through on a winter's night as he came towards the house. The chief proof was that nobody else could have done the deed. But why linger over pros and cons? The jury returned directly with a verdict of not proven, and the tired audience left the courthouse. But not until Hannah Knowles, with angry eyes, had risen to her feet. The sterner elder sister tried to pull her back. Everyone said that they should have looked to Betsy to say the awful words that followed, not to her gentler companion. It was Hannah, broken and disappointed, who cried in a strange, high voice as Enoch Holt was passing by without a look, "You stole it, you thief! You know it in your heart!" The startled man faltered. Then he faced the women. The people who stood near seemed made of eyes, as they stared to see what he would say.
"I swear by my right hand I never touched it."
"Curse your right hand, then!" cried Hannah Knowles, growing tall and thin, like a white flame drawing upward. "Curse your right hand, yours and all your folks that follow you! May I live to see the day!" The people drew back, while for a moment accused and accuser stood face to face. Then Holt's flushed face turned white, and he shrank from the fire in those wild eyes, and walked away clumsily down the courtroom. Nobody followed him. Nobody shook hands with him or told the acquitted man that they were glad of his release. Half an hour later, Betsy and Hannah Knowles took their homeward way, to begin their hard round of work again. The horizon that had widened with such glory for one night had closed round them again like an iron wall. Betsy was alarmed and excited by her sister's uncharacteristic behavior, and she looked at her anxiously from time to time. Hannah had become the harder-faced of the two. Her disappointment was the keener, for she had kept more of the unsatisfied desires of her girlhood until that dreary morning when they found the sea-chest rifled and the treasure gone. Betsy said inconsequently that it was a pity she did not have that black silk gown that would stand alone. They had planned for it over the open chest, and Hannah's was to be a handsome green. They might have worn them to court. But even the pathetic facetiousness of her elder sister did not bring a smile to Hannah Knowles's face, and the next day one was at the loom and the other at the wheel again. The neighbors talked about the curse with horror. In their minds a fabric of sad fate was spun from the bitter words. The Knowles sisters never had worn silk gowns, and they never would. Sometimes Hannah or Betsy would stealthily look over the chest in one or the other's absence. One day, when Betsy was very old and her mind had grown feeble, she tied her own India silk handkerchief about her neck, but they never used the other two. They aired the wedding suit once every spring as long as they lived. They were both too old and forlorn to make up the India mull. Nobody knows how many times they took everything out of the heavy old clamped box and peered into every nook and corner to see if there was not a single gold piece left. They never answered anyone who made bold to speak of their misfortune. Enoch Holt had been a seafaring man in his early days, and there was news that the owners of a Salem ship in which he held a small interest wished him to go out as supercargo. He was brisk and well in health, and his son-in-law, an honest but an unlucky fellow, had done less well than usual, so that nobody was surprised when Enoch made ready for his voyage. It was nearly a year after the theft, and nothing had come so near to restoring him to public favor as his apparent lack of ready money. He openly said that he put great hope in his adventure to the Spice Islands, and when he said farewell one Sunday to some members of the dispersing congregation, more than one person wished him heartily a pleasant voyage and safe return. He had an insinuating tone of voice and an imploring look that day, and this fact, with his probable long absence and the dangers of the deep, won him much sympathy. It is a shameful thing to accuse a man wrongfully, and Enoch Holt had behaved well since the trial, and what is more, had shown no accession to his means of living. So away he went with a fair amount of good wishes, though one or two persons assured remonstrating listeners that they thought it likely Enoch would make a good voyage, better than common, and show himself forwarded when he came to port. Soon after his departure, Mrs. Peter Downs and an intimate acquaintance discussed the ever-exciting subject of the Knowles robbery over a friendly cup of tea. They were in the Downs kitchen, and quite by themselves. Peter Downs himself had been drawn as a juror, and had been for 2 days at the county town. Mrs. Downs was giving herself to social interests in his absence, and Mrs. Forder, an asthmatic but very companionable person, had arrived by 2 o'clock that afternoon with her knitting work, sure of being welcome. The two old friends had first talked over varied subjects of immediate concern, but when supper was nearly finished, they fell back upon the lost Knowles gold, as has been already said.
"They got a dreadful blow, poor gals," wheezed Mrs. Forder with compassion. "'Twas harder for them than for most folks. They had a long stint with the old gentleman. Very arbitrary, very arbitrary."
"Yes," answered Mrs. Downs, pushing back her teacup, then lifting it again to see if it was quite empty.
"Yes, it took hold of Hannah the most. I should have said Betsy was a good deal the most set in her ways, and would have been most tore up, but 'twa'n't so. Lucky that Holt's folks sets on the other aisle in the meeting-house, I do consider, so they needn't face each other sure as Sabbath comes round. I see Hannah and him come face to face 2 Sabbaths afore Enoch left. So happened he dallied to have a word long o' Deacon Gooden, and him and Hannah stepped front of each other, for they knowed what they's about. I thought her eyes looked right through 'em. No one of 'em took the word. Enoch, he slinked off pretty quick." "I see 'em too," said Mrs. Forder. "Made my blood run cold. Nothing ain't come of the curse yet."
Mrs. Downs lowered the tone of her voice.
"Least folks says so. It kind o' worries poor Phoebe Holt, Miss Dow, I should say. She was nerved all up at the time of the trial, and when her next baby come into the world, first thing she made out to ask me was whether it seemed likely, and she give me a pleading look as if I'd got to tell her what she hadn't heart to ask. 'Yes, dear,' says I, put up his little hands to me kind o' wanted, and she turned a look on me like another creature, so pleased and contented. I s'pose you don't see no great of the Knowles gals?"
inquired Mrs. Forder, who lived 2 miles away in the other direction.
"They stepped to the door yesterday when I was passing by, and I went in and set a spell along of 'em," replied the hostess. "They'd got pestered with that old loom of theirn. For I thought, says I, 'tis all worn out, Betsy, says I. Why on earth don't you get somebody to get some of your own wood and season it well so it won't warp, same's mine done, and build you a new one?" But Betsy muttered and twitched away. 'Twan't like her, but they're disappointed at every turn, I s'pose, and feel poor where they've got the same's ever to do with. Hannah's a coughing this springs if something ailed her. I asked her if she had bad feelings in her pipes, and she said yes, she had, but not to speak of before Betsy. I'm going to fix her up some horehound and elecampane, quicks the ground's nice and warm, and roots livens up a grain more. They're limp and weazened long to the first of the spring. Them would be serviceable, simmered away to a syrup long molasses. Now don't you think so, Miss Forder?" "Excellent," replied the wheezing dame. "I covered a portion myself, now you speak. Nothing cures my complaint, but a new remedy takes hold clever sometimes and eases me for a spell."
And she gave a plaintive sigh and began to knit again. Mrs. Downs rose and pushed the supper table to the wall and drew her chair nearer to the stove. The April nights were chilly.
"The folks is late comin' after me,"
said Mrs. Forder ostentatiously.
"I may as well confess that I told 'em if they was late with the work, they might let go of fetching of me, and I'd walk home in the morning, take it easy when I was fresh. Course, I mean, if 'twouldn't put you out, I knowed you was all alone, and I kind of wanted a change."
"Them words was in my mind to utter while we was to table," avowed Mrs. Downs hospitably. "I ain't really afeard, but 'tis sort of creepy fastening up and going to bed alone. Nobody can't help harking, and every common noise starts you. I never used to give nothing a thought till the Knowleses was robbed, though."
"'Twas mysterious, I do maintain,"
acknowledged Mrs. Forder.
"Comes over me sometimes, p'raps 'twasn't Enoch. He'd a branched out more in course of time. I'm waiting to see if he does extra well to see, for I let my mind come to bear on his being clean-handed."
"Plenty thought it 'twas the old captain come back for it, and spirited it away. Enough said that 'twasn't no honest gains. Most on't was prize money of slave ships, and all kinds of devil's gold was mixed in. I s'pose you've heard that said?"
"Time and again," responded Mrs. Forder. "And the worst on't was simple old Pappy Flanders went and told the Knowles gals themselves that folks thought the old captain come back and got it, and hadn't done wrong to cuss Enoch Holt and his generations after him the way she done. I think it took hold on her terrible after all she'd gone through," said Mrs. Downs compassionately. "He ain't near so simple as he is ugly, Pappy Flanders ain't. I've seen him set here and read the paper sober's anybody when I've been going about my morning's work in the shed-room, and when I'd come in to look about, he'd twist it with his hands and roll his eyes and begin to get off some of his gable. I think them wandering cheap wits likes the fun on't and escapes steady work, and gets the roving habit so fixed it spiles 'em. My grand'ther was to the South Seas in his young days," related Mrs. Forder impressively, "and he said cussin' was common there. I mean sober spitin' with a cuss. He seen one of them black folks get a grudge against another, and go and set down and look steady at him in his heart and cuss him in his mind, and set there and watch, until the other kind of took sick and died, all in a fortnight, I believe he said. 'Twould make your blood run cold to hear grand'ther describe it, 'twould so. He never done nothing but set and look, and folks would give him something to eat now and then, as if they thought 'twas all right, and the other one tried to go and come, and at last he hived away altogether and died. I don't know what you'd call it that ailed him. There's something in cursing that's bad for folks, now I tell you, Miss Downs." "Hannah's eyes always makes me creepy now," Mrs. Downs confessed uneasily. "They don't look pleading and childish same's they used to. Seems to me as if she'd had the worst on't." "We ain't seen the end on't yet," said Mrs. Forder impressively. "I feel it within me, Marthy Downs, and it's a terrible thing to have happened right amongst us in Christian times. If we live long enough, we're going to have plenty to talk over in our old age that's come of that curse. Some seeds shy of sprouting till the spring when the soil's just right to breed it." "There's Lobelia now," agreed Mrs. Downs, pleased to descend to prosaic and familiar levels. "They ain't good crop 1 year in 6, and then you find it in a place where you never observed none to grow afore, like's not.
Ain't it so, really?" And she rose to clear the table, pleased with the certainty of a guest that night. Their conversation was not reassuring to the heart of a timid woman, alone in an isolated farmhouse on a dark spring evening, especially so near the anniversary of old Captain Knowles's death. Later in these rural lives, by many years, two aged women were crossing a wide field together, following a footpath such as one often finds between widely separated homes of the New England country. Along these lightly traced thoroughfares, the children go to play, and lovers to plead, and older people to companion one another in work and pleasure, in sickness and sorrow. Generation after generation comes and goes again by these country byways. The footpath led from Mrs. Forder's to another farmhouse half a mile beyond, where there had been a wedding. Mrs. Downs was there, and in the June weather she had been easily persuaded to go home to tea with Mrs. Forder, with the promise of being driven home later in the evening. Mrs. Downs's husband had been dead 3 years, and her friend's large family was scattered from the old nest. They were lonely at times in their later years, these old friends, and found it very pleasant now to have a walk together. Thin little Mrs. Forder, with all her wheezing, was the stronger and more active of the two. Mrs. Downs had grown heavier and weaker with advancing years. They paced along the footpath slowly, Mrs. Downs rolling in her gait like a sailor, and availing herself of every pretext to stop and look at herbs in the pasture grounds they crossed, and at the growing grass in the mowing fields. They discussed the wedding minutely, and then, where the way grew wider, they walked side by side instead of following each other, and their voices sank to the low tone that betokens confidence.
"You don't say that you really put faith in all them old stories? It ain't accident altogether? No ways you can fix it in your mind," maintained Mrs. Downs. "Needn't tell me that cursing don't do neither good nor harm. I shouldn't want to marry amongst the Holts if I was young again. I remember when this young man was born that's married today, and the first thing his poor mother wanted to know was about his hands being right. I said yes, they was, but last year he was 20-year-old, and come home from the frontier with one of them hands, his right one shot off in a fight. They say it happened to sights of other fellows, and their legs gone too, but I count 'em over on my fingers, them Holts, and he's the third. They say that 'twas all an accident, his mother's getting throwed out of her wagon comin' home from meetin', and her wrist not being set good, and she being run down at the time most lost it altogether, but there it is, stiffened up and no good to her. There was the second. And Enoch Holt hisself come home from the Chinese seas, made a good passage, and a sight of money in the pepper trade, just's we expected, and going to build him a new house, and the frame gives a kind of lurch when they was raising of it, and surges over onto him and nips him under. "Which arm?" says everybody along the road when they was coming and going with the doctor. "Right one. Got to lose it," says the doctor to him, and next time Enoch Holt got out to meeting, he stood up in the house of God with the hymn book in his left hand, and no right hand to turn his leaf with. He knowed what we was all a-thinking.
"Well," said Mrs. Forder, very short-breathed with climbing the long slope of the pasture hill,
"I don't know, but I'd soon be them as the Knowles gals. I'd never knowed no peace again after she spoke them words in the courthouse. They come back and haunted her, and you know Miss Downs better'n I do, being darn neighbors, as one may say, how they lived their lives out like wild beasts into a lair. They used to go out some by night to get the air," pursued Mrs. Downs with interest. "I used to open the door and step right in, and I used to take their yarn and stuff long of mine and sell 'em, and do for the poor stray creatures long's they'd let me. They'd be grateful for a mess early peas or potatoes as ever you see, and Peter he always favoured 'em with pork,
fresh and salt when we slaughtered. The old captain kept 'em chilled long as he lived, and then they was too old to learn different. I always liked Hannah the best till that change struck her. Betsy, she held out to the last just about the same. I don't know now I come to think of it, but what she felt it the most of the two. They never let me as much as get a look at 'em, complained Mrs. Forder. Folks got awful stories a-going one time. I've heard it said, and it always creeped me cold all over, that there was something come and lived with 'em, a kind of black shadow, a cobweb kind of a man-shape that followed 'em about the house and made a third to 'em. But they got hardened to it theirselves, only they was afraid 'twould follow if they went anywheres from home. You don't believe no such a piece of nonsense. But there, I've asked you times enough before. They'd got shadders enough, poor creatures, said Mrs. Downs with reserve. Wasn't no kind of need to make 'em up no spooks as I know on. Well, here's these young folks a-startin'. I wish 'em well, I'm sure. She likes him with his one hand better than most gals likes them as has a good sound pair. They looks prime happy. I hope no curse won't follow 'em. The friends stopped again, poor short-winded bodies, on the crest of the low hill, and turned to look at the wide landscape, bewildered by the marvelous beauty and the sudden flood of golden sunset light that poured out of the western sky. They could not remember that they had ever observed the wide view before. It was like a revelation or an outlook towards the celestial country, the sight of their own green farms and the countryside that bounded them. It was a pleasant country indeed, their own New England. Their petty thoughts and vain imaginings seemed futile and unrelated to so fair a scene of things. But the figure of a man who was crossing the meadow below looked like a malicious black insect. It was an old man. It was Enoch Holt. Time had worn and bent him enough to have satisfied his bitterest foe. The women could see his empty coat sleeve flutter as he walked slowly